June 23, 1834, Sunday Mass, Jefferson County, Mississippi. The congregation bowed their heads in prayer, but Josiah Copper's eyes burned like coals in the darkness. 6 white overseers, 6 bodies that would never rise again. Not by an army, not by a revolt, by the hands of one man whose name the records tried to bury. Josiah Copper, 28 years old, born into chains, trained to say, "Yes, sir," while his soul screamed no. For 17 years he had watched them drag his sister into the barn. For 17 years he had buried children who died of hunger, while the master's dogs ate prime cuts. The sound of the whip across his mother's back. The sight of his father hanging from the oak tree for looking a white woman in the eye. 6 names carved into plantation ledgers. 6 overseers who believed their skin made them gods. 6 men who never saw death coming from the hands of a field slave with nothing left to lose. And when silence fell and the blood soaked into the church floor, Josiah Copper stood among the bodies like an angel of vengeance, his work complete. That day, the name Josiah Copper was written not in any ledger, but in blood and flame and freedom. This is the untold story of courage, revenge, and justice you've never heard before. Watch the full story now, and don't miss a single moment of history that defies belief. Hit subscribe and turn on notifications, because Josiah Copper's legacy is just the beginning. Josiah Copper had been born into chains, each generation shackled by the same unyielding iron fist of plantation rule, a lineage defined by suffering and survival. The sprawling cotton fields stretched endlessly, like oceans of white fire glimmering under the relentless, blistering sun, each fiber a testament to toil and whispered despair. The earth itself seemed to mourn under the weight of human endurance, as if it remembered every lash, every groan, every stolen breath of those who had come before. Overseers prowled these fields like predatory wolves, their eyes glinting with perverse pleasure, whips coiled like serpents in their calloused hands, ready to strike without warning. Each crack of the whip was a punctuation mark on lives already defined by servitude, a cruel rhythm that dictated the heartbeat of the plantation. Yet amid this orchestrated torment, Josiah's muscles had grown into instruments of tireless labor, hardened by years of relentless, unending work. But while his body bore the scars of oppression, his spirit remained unbroken, tempered like steel in secret fires. His defiance was quiet, cunning, stored within him like a reservoir of storms, gathering strength from every insult, every injustice, every stolen moment of dignity. The plantation's chapel, a modest and weather-beaten structure of timber and fading paint, stood not just as a sanctuary for the weary, but also as a stage for the unspoken dramas of its congregation. Its walls had absorbed countless confessions, whispers of fear and hope tangled together in the solemn quiet. Yet the chapel had never witnessed the brewing tempest within Josiah, the subtle and simmering fury that coiled beneath his calm exterior. Today, the fragile boundary between faith and fear would fracture, the air thick with anticipation as the raw anatomy of vengeance threatened to rise, unstoppable and inevitable. Eve. Wry glance. Every whispered prayer, every shuffling step toward the altar carried with it the weight of generations, the memory of countless wrongs, and the promise that Josiah's reckoning was not only personal, it was ancestral. In that sacred worn space, the collision of hope, fury, and destiny would ignite, heralding a storm that had been centuries in the making. Even in the hollow, ritualistic moments of forced worship, when the congregation swayed beneath the weight of prayers not fully their own, Josiah's mind drifted far from the measured cadence of hymns. It wandered relentlessly through memories etched into the marrow of his being, memories of those cruelly torn from life by the overseer's brutal hand. Brothers had been ripped limb from limb, their screams swallowed by the endless fields. Mothers dragged screaming across sun-scorched soil into the labor that would grind them into dust. Fathers broken beneath the unrelenting iron heel of authority, their bodies bent, their spirits shattered, leaving nothing but silent, haunting lessons. Each recollection struck Josiah not merely as grief, but as a coiled spring of unquenchable rage. Tension wound tighter with every recollection of injustice. He had mastered the art of moving silently through the plantation's relentless landscape, each step measured and cautious, each gesture hiding the storm beneath. Pain became a familiar companion, falling upon him like relentless rain, each lash and each insult absorbed and transformed, not into submission, but into raw, concentrated power. Endurance, in Josiah's hands, was a weapon in disguise. Every demeaning glance, every jeering laugh from the overseers, every cruel remark whispered into the suffocating heat of the fields, became fuel for the inevitable eruption that simmered within him, waiting for the precise moment to surge. The overseers themselves, 6 men bonded by a shared sadistic camaraderie, were blind to the truth. They prided themselves on the careful architecture of terror they had imposed, the precise orchestration of fear meant to keep bodies obedient and spirits crushed. But what they failed to recognize was that their tyranny had sown a different kind of seed, one that had taken root silently, invisibly, deep in Josiah's resolve. The stage for reckoning was already arranged, every element aligned in the quiet, terrifying symmetry of destiny. The bell tolled through the plantation, its sound a grim herald that rippled across the fields, through the chapel, and into the hearts of all who heard it. History itself seemed to pause in that moment, waiting with bated breath for the storm that had been long prepared, a storm that would not merely confront the overseer's cruelty, but sweep through it with the unstoppable force of centuries of pain and unfulfilled justice. Josiah shifted his stance subtly, a movement so slight it would have gone unnoticed by anyone who did not know the language of suppressed fury. His muscles coiled beneath his skin like iron springs, each tendon taut with restrained energy, ready to snap into action at the precise moment. The air around him felt impossibly heavy, thick with the metallic scent of anticipation, as if the atmosphere itself had become a living entity, aware of the violence about to unfold. Every inhalation seemed to carry the weight of unspoken centuries, and every exhalation trembled with the promise of retribution. Around him, the candles flickered violently, their feeble flames casting elongated, trembling shadows across the worn floorboards of the chapel. The light danced like spirits in distress, illuminating the cracked walls and the sweat-streaked faces of those unaware that history was poised on the edge of a knife. The overseers, 6 men bound together by cruelty and camaraderie, continued their ritual of intimidation with practiced precision. They whispered jokes laced with malice, their laughter echoing faintly against the chapel walls, tightening their grips on whips and clubs, as if their mere presence could suppress the fire that had been simmering too long. They were blind to the fact that their carefully constructed theater of terror had planted the seeds of its own undoing. Josiah's body hummed with focused anticipation. Each muscle, each nerve, each heartbeat had become a drum of inevitability, a steady rhythm counting down to a moment that was at once inevitable and irrevocable. His senses sharpened, every sound, every flicker of movement magnified into significance. The congregation, absorbed in their muted chants and low murmurs of prayer, remained unaware of the catastrophe about to descend upon them. They had come seeking solace, seeking divine comfort, while unknown, bearing witness to the quiet gathering of a storm that was centuries in the making. Within the wooden walls of the chapel, past and present converged. The memories of oppression, the silent endurance, the calculated patience, all poised to erupt into a reckoning that would leave no corner untouched. Even the trembling shadows seemed to lean in, anticipating the collision of cruelty and resistance, the moment when control would shatter and the raw force of Josiah's resolve would claim its long-awaited due. With a sudden, almost imperceptible shift, Josiah's hand brushed against the worn, splintered edge of the wooden pew, gripping it as though it were a lifeline tethered to both the earth and the weight of generations before him. The grain of the wood pressed into his palm, rough and unyielding, grounding him in the moment while simultaneously anchoring the fury coiled within him. Each overseer moved with a distinct, recognizable pattern, a signature cruelty honed over years of practice. One sneered with an arrogance that reeked of entitlement, his eyes glittering with malice. Another struck indiscriminately, his whip carving arcs of fear into the backs and shoulders of anyone unfortunate enough to be in reach. A third whispered threats with the precision of a venomous serpent, words designed to erode the spirit as much as the body. Josiah's mind, sharp as a blade hidden beneath velvet patience, catalogued each gesture, each twitch, each subtle tell of their sadistic rhythms. Every observation was meticulously stored, every past injury filed away like ammunition, waiting for the precise moment when it could be wielded to devastating effect. His focus, honed by years of careful endurance, became almost tactile, a force radiating from him, invisible yet palpable. In the periphery, sunlight pierced the stained glass of the chapel, scattering shards of color across the floorboards and illuminating his eyes with a quiet, searing ferocity that seemed to glow from within. The contrast between the gentle, multicolored light and the storm coiling in Josiah's gaze created a tension that filled the air, thickening it with unspoken portent. Every heartbeat pulsed in tandem with the rhythm of anticipation, each one a drumbeat counting down toward the inevitable confrontation. The congregation continued to murmur, unaware of the silent calculation unfolding before them, their prayers drifting like fragile smoke in the charged atmosphere. Outside, the wind shifted, rustling the trees as if nature itself sensed the gathering force. Within the chapel, the final moment approached, tense and absolute. Time seemed to stretch, elongating the seconds as though aware of the magnitude of what was about to be unleashed. Every detail, the flicker of candlelight, the scent of sweat and wood, the suppressed breath of the crowd, coalesced into a singular, electric instant. The stage was set. The storm was ready to break, and Josiah, the calm eye within it, was poised to strike. Thoughts of freedom, vengeance, and the long-stolen dignity of countless generations surged through Josiah like a tide breaking against ancient cliffs. Each memory of injustice, each echo of cruelty inflicted upon his ancestors, coalesced into a single burning awareness that radiated through his very bones. Could violence itself be a form of redemption, he wondered, or was it merely a grim necessity carved out by centuries of oppression? Was blood the only language the oppressors could comprehend, the only means by which justice could truly register in their hardened hearts? Every strike he was poised to unleash was loaded not with mere anger, but with profound moral gravity, a reckoning shaped by years of silent suffering and observation. Yet despite the destructive potential of his actions, his wrath carried a weight of righteousness, a sense that what he was about to do was not merely personal retribution, but a fulfillment of something almost divinely ordained. The chapel, once a sanctuary of whispered prayers and trembling hope, had transformed in his mind into a crucible, its sacred air now saturated with tension, the scent of candle smoke mingling with the metallic anticipation of imminent violence. In that charged atmosphere, fear, rage, and destiny melded together, becoming a weapon of mythic proportions, intangible yet fully present, coiled within Josiah like a spring ready to release its immense force. He inhaled slowly, deliberately, each breath a conscious act of preparation, every sense heightened to a razor's edge. The subtle creak of a floorboard, the faint shuffle of the congregation, the hushed rustle of clothing, all were amplified in his perception, each sound a thread in the intricate web of timing and opportunity he had painstakingly constructed. He understood, with acute clarity, that the smallest misstep could undo everything, that a moment's hesitation or a single error could cost him not only the fulfillment of his long-awaited vengeance, but perhaps his very life. And yet, amid this precise and painstaking awareness, there was also a strange serenity, a quiet center within the storm, where purpose and fury aligned. The world outside, the endless fields, the screams of the past, and the oppressive presence of the overseers all seemed to condense into this singular, crystalline instant, where fate, justice, and wrath converged. Every muscle, every heartbeat, every thought prepared him to act, to channel centuries of pain into a decisive, irreversible moment that would echo far beyond the walls of the chapel. The 6 overseers, completely oblivious to the gathering tempest within Josiah, stepped closer, their movements slow and deliberate, each one radiating an almost arrogant confidence, born of years of unchallenged dominance. They had walked these halls countless times before, accustomed to obedience and submission, their cruel authority assumed to be absolute and unassailable. Yet they failed to notice the subtle, almost imperceptible shift in the air, the tightening of Josiah's body, the way his every muscle coiled like a drawn bow, ready to release a force that had been patiently amassed over decades of oppression. Shadows from flickering lanterns leapt and twisted across the chapel's time-worn walls, painting the room in patterns that seemed to dance in anticipation, almost sentient in their eagerness, reflecting the tension that vibrated through the very timbers. The interplay of light and darkness mirrored the storm silently raging within Josiah, a storm that had been centuries in the making, fueled by pain, rage, and a relentless quest for justice. Silence stretched taut, heavy and suffocating, filling every corner of the chapel as if the walls themselves were holding their breath, aware that the fragile boundary between control and chaos was on the verge of collapse. The only interruptions to this oppressive quiet were the fading voice of the preacher, who continued his ritual with mechanical devotion, and the distant, haunting rustle of the Mississippi wind slipping through cracks and around the wooden structure, whispering like an omen through the hollows of the building. The congregation, unaware of the imminent catastrophe, murmured prayers that seemed to float, fragile and ephemeral, into the charged air, unable to pierce the tension that enveloped the space. Every sound, every flicker of light, every subtle shift in the air seemed magnified, amplified by the anticipation that clung to the room like a living entity. This stillness was no ordinary pause. It was a pregnant moment, loaded with possibility and danger, the calm that precedes a storm, thick with expectation and threat. The chapel had become a crucible, the boundaries between past and present, vengeance and destiny, cruelty and reckoning blurring into a single, unbearable instant. Josiah stood at the center of it all, silent, taut, aware that history itself was poised to pivot on the actions about to unfold, and that the coming eruption would not simply be an act of violence, but the manifestation of generations of suffering finally given form and force. A whispered insult, sharp, deliberate, and laced with contempt, sliced through the chapel's heavy candle-lit air like a knife. It was small, almost imperceptible to anyone else, but to Josiah, it resonated like a tolling bell, the final spark, igniting the carefully restrained inferno that had been building within him for years. His patience, honed to a razor's edge through long years of silent observation and endurance, shattered completely in that instant. Every coiled muscle snapped into action with the fluidity of a predator long held in captivity, fists arcing with lethal precision toward the first target in a motion both swift and unyielding. The overseers, who had believed themselves untouchable, found themselves confronted with a force they had never even imagined, a storm that carried the weight of centuries and the cunning of a mind shaped by suffering and resolve. The first man crumpled under Josiah's blow, disbelief and shock etched across his face in frozen horror, his cruel grin evaporating into stunned silence as the world around him seemed to collapse into a single, intense moment. The congregation, caught between reverence and terror, gasped in unison, a wave of sound rising like the echo of some ancient lament. Some were frozen in horror, their bodies locked by fear and disbelief, while others flinched instinctively, recoiling from the sudden eruption of violence that shattered the fragile sanctity of the chapel. Time itself seemed to dilate, stretching each instant into a tense tableau of chaos and purpose, every movement deliberate yet devastating, every strike a precise note in a brutal symphony orchestrated by Josiah's unrelenting will. The flickering candlelight traced the arcs of his motions, casting elongated, dancing shadows across the walls, as if the room itself were caught in the rhythm of his vengeance. Each strike carried both the weight of accumulated pain and the fierce clarity of moral conviction, transforming the space from a place of ritual submission into an arena of reckoning. The air vibrated with the force of unleashed fury, thick with the mingled scents of sweat, fear, and the lingering traces of candle smoke, each inhalation a reminder of the stakes. In those moments, the world seemed to narrow to the singular focus of Josiah's wrath, every breath, every glance, every motion, a thread in the unfolding tapestry of violence, justice, and the long-delayed retribution that had finally arrived with unstoppable inevitability. The remaining 5 overseers, their confidence shattered by the sudden and devastating fall of their comrade, lunged at Josiah with frenzied desperation. But their fury was met with a force that had been meticulously honed over years of oppression, endurance, and quiet calculation. Josiah's ferocity was unlike anything they could anticipate, unyielding, precise, and tempered by the years of pain and subjugation that had shaped him. Limbs collided with bone-cracking force, bodies thudded against the worn floorboards, and the air quickly became saturated with the metallic tang of blood, mingling with the acrid scent of sweat and terror. Each strike he delivered carried far more than physical impact. It was symbolic, a carefully measured act of retribution for decades of humiliation, brutality, and stolen dignity. Every punch, every grapple, every calculated blow was an embodiment of countless voices silenced by the overseer's cruelty, a culmination of whispered fears and endured tortures now finding explosive expression through his body. The chapel, once a space of quiet devotion and fragile hope, had undergone a transformation almost alchemical in nature. Its walls, saturated with generations of prayers and confessions, now seemed to pulse with the energy of mythic justice, bending the light from flickering candles into jagged, dramatic streaks across the chaos unfolding within. The very air seemed to vibrate with the rhythm of retribution, heavy and charged, carrying with it the sense that history itself was being rewritten in those violent, deliberate moments. Josiah occupied the center of this crucible, a singular force around which the storm revolved. He embodied both vengeance and liberation, a living testament to the power that had been forged in silence and endurance, now unleashed with devastating clarity. The struggle was violent, almost balletic in its brutal, each movement controlled yet instinctively lethal, a testament to the relentless patience that had brought him to this moment. And as the overseers faltering beneath the precision and relentless drive of his assault, the chapel no longer felt merely like a building. It had become a stage for reckoning, a sacred arena where oppression met its reckoning, and where the long-suppressed voice of justice spoke in the language of force, raw and undeniable. In the center of it all, Josiah stood, every fiber of his being alight with purpose, embodying the transformation from victim to liberator, from silent endurance to unstoppable wrath. The dust that had been stirred on the chapel floor by the whirlwind of violence settled only briefly before the echoes of Josiah Copper's wrath ricocheted through the timbers, resonating like a tolling bell that could not be silenced. Each fallen overseer was more than a mere corpse. They had become symbols, grotesque representations of decades of cruelty, of chained hands and broken spirits, of stolen lives pressed under the iron heel of tyranny. Josiah's chest heaved with exertion, every breath a mix of fatigue, triumph, and barely contained fire. Sweat and blood mingled across his skin, a living canvas painted in the dual colors of suffering endured and vengeance executed, marking him as both survivor and avenger. Outside, the oppressive Mississippi sun bore down indifferently upon the endless cotton fields. But inside the chapel, the air had thickened into an altar of reckoning, charged with a gravity that demanded witness. The congregation, their eyes wide and their bodies frozen in awe and terror, watched a man transformed before them, no longer a slave, no longer merely human, but a myth, walking among mortals, embodying both wrath and liberation. Every swing of Josiah's fists, every deliberate, calculated blow, carried weight far beyond the immediate. They were imbued with the voices of ancestors whose cries had long been silenced, whose suffering had been ignored, whose endurance had paved the path to this singular eruption of justice. As the last of the 6 men writhed in disbelief and agony, Josiah's mind remained cold, precise, almost divine in its focus. He registered every sound, the snapping of pews beneath heavy weight, the muffled sobs of the terrified congregation, the whispering Mississippi wind outside that seemed to carry the murmurs of old spirits guiding his hands. This was no chaotic frenzy. It was orchestration, a rhythm born of suffering refined it into justice, a choreography of vengeance honed over a lifetime. The chapel, once a place of sacred ritual, had been transformed into a theater of reckoning, every movement of Josiah's body a stanza in a brutal, unrelenting poem, a testament to human endurance fused with divine fury. Shadows clung to the corners, twisting and dancing as if even the moon had paused to witness the birth of legend. And amidst the crescendo of violence, a quiet clarity settled over him, a stark, unwavering realization that this act, though violent and horrific, had forged him into immortality. Josiah Copper was no longer merely the oppressed. He had become the instrument of history, a figure whose name would echo through time, whispered in awe and fear alike, a myth destined to outlive both the cries of the living and the silence of the dead. Josiah Copper stood amid the ruin of the chapel, his chest heaving with ragged, uneven breaths, each inhale a testament to survival, each exhale a release of the storm he had become. His muscles trembled from the exertion of his violent ballet, yet beneath the fatigue, they burned with a fire that no whip, no lash, and no generation of unrelenting injustice could ever hope to extinguish. The bodies of the 6 overseers were strewn across the pews and splintered floorboards, limbs twisted in grotesque contortions, each corpse a silent, grim monument to the cost of tyranny and arrogance. The air itself seemed transformed, saturated with the coppery scent of blood and the acrid tang of fear now dissipated, yet still palpable, as if the very molecules had absorbed the weight of centuries of suffering. Through this thick, heavy atmosphere, the silent screams of enslaved ancestors seemed to vibrate along the timbered walls, echoing in a haunting, wordless chorus that bore witness to the culmination of countless years of subjugation, finally confronted and avenged. Outside, the Mississippi wind whispered across the fields, stirring the cotton leaves in a soft, undulating applause, as though nature itself acknowledged the gravity of the reckoning that had taken place within these walls. Josiah's sharp, unblinking gaze swept over the chapel's ruined interior, noting every broken beam, each splintered pew, as if the very structure were a sacred participant in this act of reckoning, bearing witness to the transformative eruption of justice. Amid the chaos, there was method and precision. Every swing, every strike had been deliberate, a choreography of vengeance distilled from years of silent suffering and relentless observation, refined into a lethal poetic art form. Though his body was bloodied, bruised, and exhausted, it carried the weight of myth in every movement, each heartbeat reverberating with the memory of stolen dignity. The echo of whips cracking across backs, and the quiet prayers of those who had fallen into despair long before him. Josiah had not merely reacted to oppression, he had transmuted the space into a crucible, a stage where cruelty itself was judged and executed with unflinching finality. The congregation, frozen between awe and horror, became silent witnesses to legend in the making, their wide eyes reflecting disbelief, their hearts trembling under the weight of the story that had just been enacted. As the sun dipped toward the horizon, its fading rays mingled with the flickering candlelight, casting long, merging shadows that seemed to honor the mythic significance of the moment. Josiah Copper had crossed a threshold, leaving behind mere mortality. Whispers of his fury and justice would ripple far beyond the plantation, beyond Mississippi, and beyond the bounds of memory, securing his place in the eternal narrative of resistance and wrath. And so, in the quiet aftermath, Josiah Copper stands, not merely as a man, but as a vessel of vengeance, a storm forged from centuries of pain. The chapel, scarred and bloodied, holds its breath, each shadow a witness to a fury that has reshaped the very air. Pause for a moment and let the weight of his defiance sink in, the rage of the oppressed, the triumph of spirit over chains, the birth of legend in a single, terrible Sunday. If this tale stirs something within you, something raw and unbroken, join the countless voices that will carry it forward. Subscribe, comment, or share, and let Josiah's wrath ripple across the world. For in sharing, we honor the memory of those who endured, who resisted in silence, and who, through acts of unimaginable courage, became immortal. This is more than history. It is myth made flesh, a story that refuses to fade. Let your presence here today be a testament, a whisper in the growing chorus of remembrance, and a promise that legends like Josiah Copper will never be forgotten. The chapel doors groaned under the pressure of history as Josiah Copper stepped into the blazing, unrelenting afternoon sun, emerging from the sacred violence within into a world that remained oblivious to the storm he had wrought. Each footfall across the dusty plantation grounds resonated with the weight of centuries of oppression, echoing like a drumbeat of destiny, reverberating through the cotton fields and the hearts of those who had long suffered in silence. Birds startled from the waving stalks, their cries sharp and discordant against the oppressive heat, as if nature itself recoiled from the mythic violence that had unfolded inside the chapel's walls. The surviving slaves, trembling, wide-eyed, and uncertain, dared not approach him, yet their gaze could not look away. They saw in Josiah not merely a man, but a force of reckoning, an elemental manifestation of justice and retribution that transcended any human comprehension. Sweat and blood streaked across his skin, glistening in the harsh light, but the fire in his eyes burned brighter, fiercer than the midday sun itself, a beacon of wrath and liberation. In crossing that threshold, from suffering to sovereignty, from submission to legend, Josiah had irrevocably altered the landscape of power on the plantation. The bodies of the 6 overseers, strewn like broken idols across the chapel floor, remained silent witnesses to his fury, each lifeless form a brutal testament to the devastating cost of cruelty and oppression. Already, whispers began to ripple through the plantation, starting as tentative murmurs and growing steadily into an undercurrent of awe and fear. The story of Josiah Copper, the man who had confronted 6 oppressors in a single decisive act, the man who had transformed personal vengeance into myth, and yet, beneath the triumph, there was an inescapable weight of consequence pressing down upon him. The realization that vengeance, once loosed, could never be contained, that the shadow of this day would stretch long and far, across the cotton fields, through the lives of the living, and into the collective memory of those who had endured generations of suffering. In that sun-baked moment, Josiah stood not only as the embodiment of wrath, but also as the harbinger of a reckoning whose reverberations would echo far beyond the confines of a single plantation, a single life, or a single act of defiance. The sun dipped lower over the sprawling Mississippi fields, casting long, restless shadows that stretched like grasping fingers toward the chapel, drawn as if by the inexorable gravity of Josiah Copper's wrath. The air itself seemed to pause, thick with silence that pressed on the skin and ears, broken only by the distant murmur of frightened animals, cattle shifting uneasily, birds flitting from branch to branch in anxious flight, and the soft, trembling breaths of those who had survived to witness the unthinkable violence inside the chapel. Josiah moved among them with a deliberate, measured pace, each step weighted with intention, heavy with the invisible mass of both human suffering and the mythic reckoning he had invoked. His eyes, still smoldering with a righteous and almost divine fury, scanned the plantation with surgical precision, cataloging every tree, every fence, every weathered structure that had once stood as a symbol of the cruelty and unchallenged authority he now shattered. The story of the massacre, of his singular, devastating act, would not remain confined to the timbered walls of the chapel. It would seep into the soil itself, ride upon the wind through the endless rows of cotton, and haunt the memories of every oppressor who dared to rise again. Whispers began low, almost inaudible, swelling into murmurs and then into full-blown rumors. A man, a ghost, a force of divine retribution, who had struck down 6 overseers in a single, decisive act of vengeance. And yet, despite the awe surrounding him, Josiah felt no conventional triumph. Victory carried a weight, a bitter tang that clung to his lungs, heavy with the blood and suffering required to achieve it. Every swing of his fists, every precise, lethal strike, was etched into his body and soul as if branded with fire into iron, leaving scars invisible to the eye but indelibly marked upon his being. The plantation, once a realm of unquestioned domination, now quivered beneath the tremors of legend, shaking as the reverberations of his fury spread through the fields and pastures. In that trembling, fear and reverence took root, embedding themselves in the collective consciousness of all who bore witness. Josiah Copper would not merely survive in memory, he would endure as a symbol, an echo, a dark myth whose shadow stretched beyond the boundaries of land and time, a harbinger of justice that would haunt the hearts of tyrants and oppressors for generations yet unborn, a living testament to the reckoning born of suffering and unbroken will. Night fell over the plantation like a velvet curtain, deep and impenetrable, pierced only by the pale, indifferent glow of the moon, which cast a spectral light across the cotton fields and the shattered chapel. The silver illumination revealed the aftermath of Josiah Copper's vengeance with a ghostly clarity, highlighting every splintered pew, every fallen beam, and every dark stain upon the wooden floor, a brutal testament to the fury that had been unleashed within those sacred walls. He walked deliberately among the remnants of destruction, each step measured, hands still trembling not from exhaustion, but from the weight of the magnitude of what he had wrought. Every heartbeat seemed to echo with the lives he had touched, both the oppressors who had fallen to his righteous wrath and the oppressed whose spirits he had ignited. From the shadows, the surviving slaves observed him, their hearts pounding, their breaths held in awe and fear, yet within them stirred a nascent fire, a spark of defiance and possibility ignited by his decisive act. Josiah felt it as well, the transmutation of years of suffering into legend, pain refined into power, enforced submission transformed into the raw, unstoppable force of immortality. Each swing of his arm, every strike precise and deadly, each drop of blood spilled, had etched his story into the very soil, air, and timber of the plantation, as if the land itself would carry his tale into perpetuity. Even the trees, the fences, and the cotton-laden fields seemed to recoil, hushed and reverent, acknowledging that the balance of power had irrevocably shifted. Josiah Copper was no longer merely a man subject to the whims of human cruelty. He had become a reckoning made flesh, a figure whose name would ripple through whispered tales, campfire stories, and secret confidences long after the gates of the plantation had closed and the oppressed were forgotten. And yet, within this mythic transformation, there lingered solemnity, a quiet, profound understanding that vengeance carried a cost, that power demanded vigilance, and that legends were remembered not merely for their fury, but for the indelible echoes they left behind, shaping the minds and spirits of those who came after. Bathed in the cold, silvery moonlight, Josiah Copper stood as both shadow and beacon, suspended between mortality and myth, his presence a living testament, his story destined to traverse time, whispering truth, warning, and the enduring weight of justice in equal measure. The plantation lay in uneasy silence, a stillness that was almost unnatural, heavy with the lingering echoes of violence that refused to dissipate, clinging to the wooden beams, the cotton-strewn fields, and the very air itself, like a stubborn, unyielding fog. Josiah Copper stood at the edge of the vast fields, alone, the moonlight glinting off his bloodied hands and casting long, spectral shadows that stretched across the cotton, as if the land itself were trembling in recognition of the deeds performed upon it. Each stalk, each leaf, seemed to shiver with memory, the wind carrying whispers that were half memory, half myth, as though the earth itself bore witness to the enormity of the act, the annihilation of 6 overseers in a single, decisive strike. Survivors huddled in the corners of the fields and along the edges of the plantation, wide-eyed, hearts pounding, souls trembling, knowing that they had witnessed not merely violence, but the birth of a legend, a figure who had defied chains, cruelty, and death itself. Josiah's mind wandered over the faces of those lost to brutality, each remembered scream, each stolen life weaving into a tapestry of sorrow, rage, and justice that now coursed through him like molten iron. The story of 6 overseers, felled in one righteous, inexorable act, would travel far beyond the gates of this plantation, carried in hushed whispers, shared in fear and reverence, a cautionary tale, a symbol of resistance, a spark for generations yet unborn. And yet, beneath the myth, the man remained grounded in solemn reflection, fully aware that acts of vengeance cast long, inescapable shadows that would cling to his soul for the rest of his life. In this quiet, almost sacred stillness, Josiah Copper became more than human. He became an echo of every suffering voice, a living monument to grief, fury, and the unyielding resilience of those who had refused, said to be broken by oppression. His name, whispered through the leaves, across the endless fields, carried on the restless wind, and later murmured in the hush of future chapels, would endure as both warning and inspiration, a dark legend, an unshakable testament to memory and myth fused into one, a truth as enduring and relentless as the land itself. As the first pale light of dawn crept hesitantly over the Mississippi horizon, the plantation remained suspended in a profound hush, as though the very earth itself bowed in acknowledgement of the weight of Josiah Copper's deeds. The bodies of the 6 overseers, now silent and grotesque monuments, had become more than remnants of cruelty. They were transformed into cautionary echoes, warnings that would ripple far beyond this soil, etched into memory as undeniable proof of the price of oppression. Josiah stood beneath the sprawling oaks, their gnarled branches swaying softly in the morning breeze like silent witnesses to a truth too immense, too heavy for mortal words to contain. He was no longer simply a man forged in chains. He had transcended flesh and circumstance, becoming a living legend, an embodiment of wrath refined into justice, of resistance rendered unassailable, of the indomitable spirit of every soul that had been denied freedom. Birds circled overhead, their sharp cries cutting across the dawn like fragments of voices long silenced, reminders of lives stolen yet now, in a strange and solemn way, reclaimed through his defiance. Each whispered retelling, each fearful glance exchanged among the survivors, every silent prayer uttered in the shadow of the massacre would carry his name forward, shaping it into myth, amplifying it beyond the bounds of time. The plantation itself seemed to inhale and pause, as though recognizing the irrevocable shift in power, that tyranny had been confronted, challenged, and upended in a singular, unforgettable act. Josiah Copper would traverse the lands of memory forever, a figure neither celebrated nor glorified in the simple sense, but revered as a reckoning, as a shadow, as an immutable truth that no chain, no lash, no legacy of cruelty could ever erase. In the fragile hush of dawn, as the cotton fields shimmered in the soft, trembling light, his story crystallized into eternity, a solemn, unflinching myth of vengeance, courage, and uncompromising justice. The legend would endure, whispered across generations, a dark pulse in the heartbeat of history itself, an enduring testament that even in the deepest shadows of oppression, fury, resolve, and righteous defiance could rise, and that names like Josiah Copper would live on, indelible, unbroken, and unforgettable.